So like I covered in my previous video on the series, which was a long time ago, but let's not get into that, Dark Souls 2 was divisive. One of the biggest reasons as to why being that Hidetaka Miyazaki wasn't leading the project, unlike with Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. After development had finished on Bloodborne, Miyazaki was back to helm the so far final entry in the Souls series. This is Dark Souls 3. The intro has gone back to the Dark Souls 1 approach, setting up some of the big names you'll come across as bosses later in the game. This time around being the Lords of Cinder, those who have linked the fire once in the past, being brought back to life, and they don't want to go through it again. That leaves the duty to the unkindled, those that tried to link the fire and failed along the way, where our character comes in, one of the many failures given another chance, fittingly beginning their journey in the Cemetery of Ash. It's fairly straightforward, but I like the aspect of having an optional, hard challenge in this tutorial area with the giant crystal lizard hidden away on a side path. At the end of the route lies the first boss fight of the game, Udex Gundyr, having to pull the sword out of his body for the fight to begin, meaning you can get a good few hits in while he's getting up. In my opinion, he's the hardest first boss in the Dark Souls trilogy. When you know what you're doing or if you've played before, he is pretty simple, but I can remember really struggling my first time, especially with the surprise appearance of what we come to know as the Pus of Man in his second phase, a recurring ability throughout the game that many enemies can harness. And from what I found, quite a few people seem to feel the same way about him. After defeating him, another optional challenge is what I can only describe as the Katana Weeb man who stands near the entrance to Firelink Shrine, and yet he's a pain this early on. Firelink Shrine is more or less our new home, where the vast majority of NPCs we'll meet across the game will gather, streamlining this aspect of Dark Souls somewhat. To start off, we have the Firekeeper, our level up lady akin to the Maiden in Black, Emerald Herald, and the Doll respectively. The return of the GOAT Andre, who I believe is the exact same Andre as in Dark Souls 1. Man is that much of a chad that his hobby keeps him sane and happy. We should all strive to be like Andre. And finally, a woman who's only known as the Handmaiden, but I'll talk about her later. Using the coiled sword we got from the Gundyr fight, we can now teleport to the High Wall of Lothric. This will now serve as the primary gameplay loop. Explore around the world, light more bonfires and collect souls, teleport back to Firelink Shrine to level up, upgrade weapons, etc. Getting further on, Emma, the old lady sat in the church, will give you a banner. She also has an interesting tidbit to her, but I'll get to that later in the video when it's relevant. Go down the stairs opposite and we come across another boss, Vort of the Boreal Valley. His quick, animalistic movements seem intimidating at first, but once you get a feel for how he moves and realise that he doesn't have much of a counter to hitting his stupidly thick dumpy, he's honestly a bit of a pushover. Waving the banner signals a bunch of gargoyles to pick you up and lift you to the new section of the game, the Undead Settlement. It's here you find a bunch of corpses of the new species from the intro. They're called pilgrims, except one of them isn't dead. This is Yul, and when speaking to him he feels indebted to be in your service and will move to Firelink. It's also here you can help Greyrat, a thief we let out back at the High Wall. We can loot from a body Loretta's bone, and it's never directly stated, but I've always had the impression that this is his mother, and this confirms for him that she's gone. And I believe the new enemies here are responsible. Namely, the Evangelists, really difficult to deal with in early game, and I have to say, I am absolutely 100% certain that they're the wife of the fat officials from Demon Souls, and no one can convince me otherwise. It is worth fighting her though, as the reward on a nearby corpse is an Estus shard. These are given to Andre in order to increase the amount of times you can drink from your flask. There's also a fun secret with one of the enemies with a cage on his back. Don't attack him and you'll be given a prompt to climb inside, resulting in him dumping you in a big hole that you'll return to later, but for now it serves as the main hub for the Moundmaker's Covenant. And since I mentioned the Estus Flask, I should quickly mention that there's a new type of flask in Dark Souls 3, the Ashen Estus Flask. Whereas the normal Estus Flask restores HP, the Ashen Estus Flask restores MP, so magic. This is not going to be relevant at all to my playthrough though. Like I mentioned back in the Demon Souls video, this is a big bonk household and we're keeping true to that, so I'm not using Ashen Estus at all, but I thought it was worth mentioning since it is quite a new significant addition. Speaking of that, it's not too long you're away from the pit either though, as it's used as the arena for the fight against the curse-rotted Greatwood. A pretty underwhelming gimmick boss, although he does get funny points for hitting him in the balls to hurt him. Once you beat him, if you give a soul to Ludleth, a character I neglected to mention back at Firelink, he can make items from boss souls for you. He's the only Lord of Cinder who's willing to sacrifice himself to link the fire, and he takes great pride in that fact. We've got a bit of an NPC lightning round now, so let's start off with Arena of Kareem. She serves as the miracle vendor in this game, accompanied by Egan, a knight who's dead set on protecting her in his own weird way, locking her away from anyone else until you go fish her out of a dingy room she's stuck in. After encountering these two, almost right away we meet the onion charred Siegfried of Katarina himself. If you take the lift up, you'll find him on the roof in a familiar scenario, pondering on how best to take on the nearby demon. Rushing in is the answer. Onion Boy's got your back though, so don't worry. Once it's been taken care of, make sure to pay a visit to the giant up top. If you talk to him, he'll be your friend, meaning that you can loot the items in the graveyard just before Greatwood without him sniping you. Again, it's worth it, since there's an undead bone shard there, which increases the amount your Estus heals for. Onto the Road of Sacrifices, and you'll encounter one of my favourite characters, Anri and her companion Horus, two knights who are on a quest of their own. Interestingly, Anri will always be the opposite gender of the player character. I've heard and I like both performances, but I prefer the female version. Anri's friendly enough, and whilst he's not hostile, Horus isn't much of a talker. But Anri says that he's a good person, so I'll take her word for it. The road takes two routes, one straight ahead into a poisonous swamp and another for a slight detour to get an item you'll need for progression. The boss that stands in your way in the latter route is the Crystal Sage, another pretty weak one. It's like Pinwheel, if Pinwheel was like 30% more threatening, I guess. When entering the Cathedral of the Deep, we come across a man praying. This is Gale, a character that serves as a portal to the DLC content, but as that's mainly built for the post-game, I'll be talking about it at that point. Oh, and get used to hearing about the merciful goddess, mother of the forlorn. I say that, but it's actually a positive in a roundabout way, as there are many shortcuts that loop back to this particular bonfire, and you'll always hear that starting line when you get close. It's kind of a smidgen of that design philosophy I love from Dark Souls 1. I don't love the infinitely respawning hollows. They're annoying more than anything though. Mainly just physically getting in your way rather than a gameplay challenge though, if that makes sense. This general area was pretty good for farming souls though, since I was able to buy the tower key from the old handmaid, which I'll use soon. There's a more pressing matter at hand. Siegfried's stuck in a well. How did he get in there? Some rascals nicked his armor, but that's weird. He's here in the chapel. What? Well, turns out the thief is none other than Patches. What? Yeah, of course it was Patches. The chapel itself is decently fun to explore. It's definitely got the most variety of enemy types we've seen so far. The Deacons of the Deep are another gimmick boss admittedly, but it's one that I'm quite fond of. When you enter the room, you're greeted with a massive crowd of enemies, one of which will be glowing. You kill the glowing enemy, and soon after another enemy will start glowing. Rinse and repeat until about halfway through the fight, until the, I guess, Super Deacon shows up, and you focus your attention on him. I just think the idea of mowing through a bunch of mooks is neat, alright? Like, Devil May Cry is really cool. Doing that in Dark Souls is cool. So, I've got what I need for progression, so let's explore more of Firelink. Way up by the ceiling is the Pickle Pea Pumperum Girl. I should probably elaborate. So in all the Souls games, including Demon Souls, there's an off-screen bird woman. You can leave items in her nest and she'll trade you different ones in return. There's also a Firekeeper soul up here. I think the implication being that this is where they throw Firekeepers away once they've died. Now, I did say I've got what I need for progression in the chapel, but that doesn't mean there's nothing else to see there. There's a rooftop section with some absolute twat knights that are intent on knocking you off the roof all the goddamn time. It's here that you can find Rosaria, the leader of another covenant, and this character specifically seems to be a magnet for theories. So let's go over some, the most popular one being that she's Guinevere, or her descendant, as her soul grants a miracle of hers. Another is that she's a citizen of the Boreal Valley turned into a monster, similar to what happened to Vought. Don't worry, we'll talk about that later, and who's behind it soon, later. Or that she was a sacrifice to Aldrich, and lastly, that she's a character named Gertrude who's more prominent at the end of the game. What do I think? I tend to go with the first theory that she is, was, or is a descendant of Guinevere. Which exactly, I'm personally not sure. Moving on from this, after tracking down Patches and buying Onion Boy's armor back from him, you can go back to the well and throw his armor down for him to continue his adventure. Also, speaking of Patches, he can lock you up in that tower back at Firelink like the cheeky chap he is. But I find it interesting that he and Grey Rat seem to be friends. Weird that Patches of all characters has any, like, he seems to be the one character that would have no pals, but apparently not. The only real use of the aforementioned Firekeeper soul is to give our Firekeeper it so she can heal the Dark Sigil, what makes you appear hollow if you take up yours offer to increase your power, which, yeah, but wouldn't you, it's literally 3 levels, plus it costs a lot to heal the sigil, and since it's got no effect on gameplay, I don't tend to bother with it. However, after leveling you a few times, Yul will actually die, and in his place is a woman named Yuria, who claims to be a good friend of his. She won't level you up though, so Yul's instantly cooler. RIP. Someone at Firelink that I'm actually happy to see. It's Anri and Horus. Since Aldrich wasn't in his coffin, they speak of him returning to his home, Irithyll, so that's their next destination. Oh, and there's a guy here who's your pyromancy tutor. I freed him back in the Undead Settlement and honestly completely forgot about his existence until, like, accidentally running into him back at Firelink. Grey Rat's dead set on going out on a thieving spree from us, so while he does that, time to go down the other path on the road to sacrifices. And here's this giant enemy crab. It feels like they have no weak points, you cannot do massive damage. I find them really scary and hard to fight, and I hate them. But a new enemy that I do like, the return of the Chad Black Knight, baby. Now, as hated as Poison Swamps are, I think Firing Keep is probably my least favourite one. Even more so than Earthen Peak in Dark Souls 2, and I know that one's particularly unpopular. It's just far more confusing to navigate for me. Everywhere looks the same, I end up getting lost extremely easily, and on top of that, there's 3 flames you have to extinguish to open up the path forward, and I always miss one, and it just stresses me out so much. But, the one bright side, the big perk sword is here, let's fucking go! There's a new covenant you can join by interacting with the Wolf Corpse. This and the upcoming boss are all massive callbacks to Artorias and Sif, with the Abyss Watchers taking inspiration from his legend. On the path above is a stray demon, and he really seems to be really worse for wear. Now, this is going to be a recurring theme for Demonkind as a whole in this game, but I'll expand on that in their actual domain. Now, it's time to fight the Abyss Watchers, and what an amazing fight it is, because they were so focused on destroying any single sign of the Abyss, they've devolved into endlessly fighting each other now they're so far gone, making for a really cool gimmick of the fight being a complete free-for-all. The second phase, however, they pull all of their power together into a single body for a good old-fashioned one-on-one duel. Fun fact, it's likely that the wolf I mentioned before was also going to take part in the fight, calling back to the Artorias-Sith dynamic even more, but this idea was scrapped and potentially reused for the Red Wolf of Radagon boss in Elden Ring, the moveset specifically. He took a short absence after first meeting him at Firelink, but after beating the Abyss Watchers, Hawkwood, this game's equivalent of the Crestfallen Warrior, makes his return, as he used to be one of them. Like in the first game, you can give Coal Collector to Andre, however the old bitch prefers Ashes, which upon given expands what she can sell to you. And speaking of selling, Grey Rat's come back. Welcome home, buddy. With that all done, it's on to the Catacombs of Carthus. Anri's here, and she's been separated from Horus, so of course we've promised to let her know if we see him. Unlike a very similar area in the first Dark Souls, i.e. the Tomb of the Giants, I really like the Catacombs. It's sprawling with lots of tucked away roots and goodies, and what I can only describe as a rolling skeleton boulder, and there's multiple of them. How can you not love that? Just what a fun concept. We dip back to Firelink to give the old wench the ash she loves so much. Freak. And speak to a woman who's heard of us, and she offers to assist us when her sign is available. She doesn't give her name, but based on her emo, it's safe to assume she's part of the Darkmoon Covenant. At the end of the Catacombs is my favourite part of it, the skeleton bridge. Not only is tons of skeletons falling from a cut bridge just a hilarious visual, it also hides a clever secret. Anri's here as well, but with no sign of Horus. To escape from here, we have to take down Wolnir, a skeleton who loves his bling, but he's not a very good or challenging boss. Just break his jewellery and he dies from shock. Now, about that clever secret, you can use the broken bridge as a ladder down into a new, optional area. In the first room, you're greeted with two tough opponents, a large demon and a mimic, but you can make the two fight each other if you're crafty enough, and it's really fun to watch. This room leads into the Smouldering Lake, the last remnants of demonic society. A huge cannon will periodically fire at you, which you can use to your advantage to kill this giant lightning worm, who is absolutely, definitely Solaire, for sure. That is just a fact. A game fact. Thanks for what? No. I don't know how this theory came about, because it uses lightning? No. The boss door is right past him, housing the old Demon King. A decent fight that has a small surprise when he's nearly met his end. Unlike most bosses who power up towards their end, the Demon King uses one last explosion in an attempt to stop you and just keels over. The fight from that point onward is being more or less a mercy killing, which is a neat little twist on an often used concept, especially in Dark Souls 3, of them powering up in a second phase or near the end of the fight. Smouldering Lake appears to be Izalith and Ash Lake combined into one area, with Izalith collapsing and merging with the lake to create this new setting. The insides of the demon ruins are littered with Capra, Taurus and stray demon corpses, as well as a mummified Quilana and Fair Lady. With her being so afraid to connect with any remaining family member back in Dark Souls 1, there's something that's deeply bittersweet about the pair finding some form of happiness in each other's company right before the end. After getting through the ruins, you can thankfully turn off the cannon via a lever next to it, but it's guarded by some real nasty enemies, bone wheel skellies, and skeletons that have quick bleed build-up to name a few. In a cave tucked away in the corner here, I also find Horus, who's turned hollow. I went to go back to tell Anri that I sadly had to put Horus down, but she's gone, and with everything more or less fully explored, it's time for me to leave the catacombs as well. The vista that you're greeted with walking out of the catacombs is nothing short of beautiful. This simple act of walking out into this wintry city has got to be one of my favourite moments in the entire series. It's genuinely jaw-dropping. When you step onto the bridge, you're ambushed by... That's just straight up the Beast of Darkness. I know it's technically called the Sullivan Beast, but come on. They're named after Pontiff Sullivan, the individual pulling the strings behind most of the heinous actions surrounding the Cathedral of the Deep in Aldridge. He's also the reason Vought looks the way he does. As one of his most trusted soldiers, you can see his ghost and another figure leaving the Boreal Valley. However, they were both given rings. What they didn't know is that the further away they got from the Pontiff, the quicker they would transform into monsters. And that's what he does with his closest soldiers. Safe to say, he's a bit of a dodgy fella. I like fighting pretty much all of the enemies here individually, aside from the Fire Witch, but having a bunch of them packed together at once isn't very fun. Deeper into the town, we come across Anri in a church and finally inform her of Horus's fate. It's now that Anri's fate can take a very drastic turn. If you leave her at this point, a disguised pilgrim will assassinate Anri on orders of Uriah, where you can marry her corpse for the Lord of Hollows ending. That is nasty. If you kill the pilgrim, her quest will continue, but you're locked out of progressing Uriah's and getting said ending. That's not the ending I'm going for, so I killed the pilgrim so Anri can continue on her journey. To continue, we have to go via the sewer, which has some really creepy grudge/ring inspired enemies. I don't like them. Lucky for us, Sigurd is here to cheer us up with a toast and some Esther soup. What a giga champion. I love this man. But it's not all fun and games, as he alludes to upholding an important promise with somebody. Near to him is a room that gives off intense Anno Londo vibes, going as far as having silver knights staring at portraits of Guinevere. This woman, she's cropped up again, and she's gonna in the future. We quickly nip back to Firelink to give the handmaiden some doo-doo feces ass we found, no less than what she deserves to be honest, as well as lighting the bonfire for the nearby Irithyll dungeon before exploring more of the Boreal Valley, and then taking on the boss, Pontiff Sullivan himself. He's a really good boss. In fact, in earlier builds he was apparently the final boss, which makes a lot of sense. He comes from the Painted World, a world built specifically for those with no place to belong. As the Pontiff was born there, he never experienced any sort of loss, and thus he desired more, leaving the Painted World and orchestrating Aldrich's faithful from behind the scenes and overtaking the Boreal Valley, so safe to say he's on the naughty list. After beating him, Grey Rat goes on another thieving spree, and oh dear, Silver Night Archers next to steep falls? This also feels very familiar. Gwendolyn's old room? Uh-huh. We're back in Anno Londo, baby! The Boreal Valley is just one of the many towns shown below Anno Londo way back in the introduction cutscene when we arrive here in the first game, and of course, Anno Londo's now under Sullivan's control. It might seem a bit gratuitous fan service in retrospect, but the build-up was extremely well done. It was pretty subtle and gradual, with a couple familiar elements at a time before the full reveal. I know for a fact it got me my first time playing, like I had no clue that this was Anno Londo before the actual pop-up. Before we go forward, we need to take a step back and walk on an invisible platform in order to meet Yorshka. She states that she's the daughter of Gwyn and sister of Gwendolyn, taking leadership of the Darkmoon Covenant for him as he became ill. However, I'm firmly of the belief that this is meant in the form of a found family, but I'm convinced she has to be related to Priscilla in some way. Look at her, if she was named Priscilla Jr., I wouldn't bat an eye. But her question about you being able to fly and the response she gives is very wholesome. Big fan. Of course, Dark Souls has to offset something nice with something horrible. Rest in peace, giant blacksmith. You were a real one. In a slight twist, you can be summoned by Anri to beat Aldrich. It doesn't count towards you beating him, but it advances her questline. Her and Horus were two of many children that were taken in to be fed to Aldrich, them being the only survivors. That's what Anri's quest is all about, not necessarily linking the fire or destroying all the Lords of Cinder, but destroying the being that's directly responsible for causing her and Horus so much suffering and trauma. There's speculation that she's going mad or going hollow as she speaks about Horus saying that they did it, but I always just viewed it as her honouring her fallen friend. I love everything about Aldrich, his backstory, his concept, his design, the atmosphere of the actual fight, since you do walk on him eating Gwendolyn. You can even hear the god's groans of pain outside of the boss room. The actual fight? I cannot stand. His movements feel so random to me, and he does way too much damage way too quickly that's really difficult to reliably dodge. Now, I have a personal, I guess you call it headcanon regarding Aldrich. Is this me coping because I think it's really silly to introduce a whole new age in the final entry of a series? Maybe, but I always took the view that the Age of the Deep isn't real. Aldrich is just completely wrong and delusional. He seems to have the power to look into people's dreams or people's minds, since he imagines the life hunt scythe Priscilla has and can use Gwendolyn's spells while he's eating him. I think what he views as the Age of the Deep is him looking into his own mind, the dregs he sees representing his own growing depraved thoughts and urges, his visions of his age becoming more intense and dreg-filled the more he sinks into his own urges, resulting in the Deep becoming more corrupted, i.e. him becoming a moist, soggy, blobby mess, and since he has the power to bring things that he imagines to life, or things that are in dreams to life, he's brought dregs into the actual world since he's become this far gone, this reprehensible and depraved. He's brought his corrupted ideals into the real world, hence you can pick up dregs from his followers. I have absolutely nothing to support this is just my own little idea that I came up with. I would have liked more direct comments on what's happened from Yorshka after the fight though. From what I can gather in the final game, she doesn't seem to know of Gwendolyn's fate, however there was a cut item you can pick up after the fight, being Gwendolyn's finger, which you could give to Yorshka. Presumably this is breaking the news to her. I wish they kept this. It would have been much more effective to connect with her as a character more directly if we got her thoughts on the fate of her loved one instead of her being there just to run the Dark Moon Covenant. Well, we may have missed that, but we still get the big sad when giving the giant call to Andre. His dialogue is genuinely heartbreaking, poor guy. That's everything we can do here though, so it's time to head into the next area, the Irithyll Dungeon. Ludleth has a message for us, namely that Anri has left Firelink and left her sword with the Little Lord to give to you as thanks for what you've done for her. I think the Irithyll Dungeon was designed to be a callback to the first section of the Tower of Latria from Demon Souls, but I'd happily take the Mind Flayers there over these jailers any day. They have this really frustrating mechanic of decreasing your maximum health bar. I just despise fighting them. And these poor prisoners, they're not an issue to fight, but their story is just downright depressing. These were once normal people, but because they're criminals, the king figured that they would make perfect subjects to be experimented upon, to fuel his obsession to becoming a dragon. These early stages clearly didn't work out, resulting in these monsters. If you manage to escape the dungeon, the next destination is to the profaned capital, home of Yorm the Giant. The first thing we see, though, is the corpse of Laddersmith Gilligan from Dark Souls 2. No clue how he died, all I know is that he 1000% deserved it. Rest in peace, you little harlot. Under the capital is something even worse than Gilligan somehow. Yeah, it's possible, I know. It's not a poison swamp, it's a toxic swamp. Ew. And it houses one of my least favourite enemies, the hand babies. Not only are they unsettling as fuck, they mainly attack by rolling around randomly, and that's something I'm not a fan of. But we need to persist to free Siegfried, who rewards us with a Titanite slab. But we're not reunited for long, as he says he has his own road to take, and so do we, as we now have the key to free the witch back in the dungeon. We gave Andre a call we found back at the profaned capital as well, and he makes a very fascinating comment about a possible link between that location and the Abyss. Like most other NPCs, the witch we freed is back here too. Her name is Carla, and she seems to have some issues regarding her sense of self-worth, calling herself a heretic and nothing more than a child of the Abyss, but she hasn't caused anyone any harm as far as I know, hence I saved her. I love the profane capital and the backstory of the city in its relation to Yorm, but we barely got to spend any time in it, which I found extremely unfortunate. The profane capital was originally ruled by an ancestor of Yorm's, an ancient conqueror who ruled over his subjects with an iron fist, and although Yorm was similarly hated, despite, as far as I know, he actually was a kind leader, he didn't rule or abuse his subjects as far as I know, he was asked to lead the people due to his immense strength. Yorm seems to be good-hearted, like I say though, as he provided the people with a weapon named the Storm Ruler, his greatest weakness, and asked to be killed if he were to ever lose his way. He also made this promise with a close friend, none other than Siegfried. This is what he's been referring to the whole game. Now Yorm's abandoned his duty to link the fire, Siegfried has come with his own Storm Ruler to do as his friend requested. This whole fight also serves as a callback to the Storm King fight in Demon Souls, and whilst I do like this fight spectacle-wise, I do prefer the former. When you speak to Siegfried after the fight, you're whisked back away to the High Wall of Lothar in a cutscene, but if you return, you can collect his armor, shield, and Storm Ruler, the implication being now that their promise is fulfilled, his adventure has now come to an end. The next boss we fight is quite a challenge, so before getting to that I want to finish off a couple of side quests. First, we've got Cyrus, the Dark Moon Lady that I mentioned a while back. She needs some help against Kraton the Wanderer, a dark spirit that returns from Dark Souls 2, although this is most definitely like a cameo rather than the actual character coming back. Cyrus has a vendetta against the Rosaria's Fingers Covenant, and she gives us items in exchange for our assistance. Next is the matter of Anri. If Ludleth said she left, where did she go? You can find her on a hill close to the Cathedral of the Deep. With nothing left, she's gone hollow and attacks, and although it might seem trivial, I think it's really vital that you get nothing after beating her. She's lost everything. She achieved what she set out to do, granted, but now she's got absolutely nothing left to give, and it's a truly tragic end for such a likable character. Cirrus is in need of our help once again, with her next target being her own granddad, the Covenant representative in the Pit of Hollows. With him more or less losing his mind, she sees no other recourse, and that's pretty sad. After this, she pledges her loyalty to you when speaking to you in Firelink and becomes your knight, so that's nice. Okay, boss time. We have to go up against the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, and her intro cutscene is so goddamn creepy. The sounds she makes are scary on their own, but if you actually reverse them, you can hear her laughing as she appears and then like kind of crying. Honestly, the best part of this boss is probably its sound design. Although I love that her theme is far more subdued, and I also really like the sounds of her stomping around the arena, that adds to her imposing factor as well. If you reverse a lot of her noises that she makes, like it ranges from like laughing, like I said before, to crying, to her coughing, like she's potentially like drowning or like being choked maybe, as she's just losing air, it sounds like. And also you can hear her like a very human scream. It's really, really fucking unsettling. Now, I've mentioned a few times about the Boreal Knights and their ultimate fate. Two knights were sent away by Sullivan. One was Vought, and the dancer here was the other, probably suffering from the Pontiff's hand the most other than Gwendolyn. The secret I wanted to mention at the start of the video as well is that you can actually fight her as one of the first bosses if you attack Emma when you meet her initially, and that sounds insanely difficult as a starter boss, as she's tricky even at the point where you're supposed to fight her. Past the dancer is an optional area known as the Consume King's Garden, so I'm going to head this way for the time being, and it's another toxic swamp. Excellent. Well, at least the boss here is far more enjoyable than the area itself. Like with Aldridge, you can hear him even before you go through the fog gate, screaming out, making for an intimidating first impression from the get-go. This is Osiris, the Consumed King. This isn't just a title, this is the King of Lothric. His disturbing appearance being the result of his dragon obsession, heavily implied to be due to finding research from none other than Seath the Scaleless. He seems to believe you're after his presumably youngest child, Ocelot, Child of Dragons. He's even cradling something, but there's nothing in his hand. During his fight, he's constantly calling out to this invisible child, and you can hear crying throughout the fight as well, before going into an intense violent rage about halfway through the battle. Now, originally there apparently was a model for a baby, and a lot more disturbing audio was going to be used in the battle transition, making it clear that his son was present and crushed by his father when he loses his mind. However, this had to be censored for very obvious reasons, let's be real. And if this is true, I much prefer the final product. My favourite thing about this fight is that sense of uncertainty, that constant doubt on whether Ocelot is genuinely in the room, or if the consumed king is truly this far gone and just imagining his lost son. The mystery makes things far more compelling in my opinion. After a Cyrus, we pick up a very valuable emote, as it's required to unlock another hidden area, but I'm not going to go there yet or go through this upcoming area, the Intended Graves, so let's continue along the main path for now. One thing I never fully understood though, the dragon heads that breathe fire past the small bridge, are they piloted by the 2+ of men that you defeat? Is there some sort of mechanism? Is it magic? I'm honestly not sure. If someone could clarify for me in the comments, like, please do. The following boss, the Dragon Slayer armor, seems to be possessed by the Pilgrim Butterflies, the creatures flying around the area, although they only directly participate in the fight right at the very end. There's no way to damage them or stop them from firing projectiles at you as far as I'm aware though. Given the name, it's highly likely they're linked to the Pilgrims, potentially being a form they can turn into after death. I also believe the butterflies are related to another enemy that appears in the DLC, so I'll speak more on them when we get to that. Onto the Grand Archives. It's kinda like the Duke's Archives, but better. Sure, it might have the Crystal Sage back as a normal enemy. Boo. But it's got the Sacred Combats. Ayy. It's not fun and games here despite the wax dunking though. It's here you can find Greyrat's corpse. When he goes on his 3rd thieving mission, there is no way whatsoever of saving him. As I'm sure you can guess, the archives are the main operating base of the Scholars, one of the 3 main pillars of Lotharic's rule, the other 2 being the Knights and the Priestesses. It's heavily implied that someone high up in the Scholars were the one to convince Lotharic to abandon linking the fire, and I have 3 main suspects for this. One being Sullivan. As we've established, he's a bit of a schemer, but he doesn't seem to have much influence outside of Anor Londo and outside of specifically Aldridge's cult, for lack of a better term. Number 2 is Aldia. If he's still alive and in Lotharic by the time of Dark Souls 3, he certainly could, as he saw linking the fire as the first sin, and which he's a scholar of. It would make sense for him to try and talk Lotharic out of it. And lastly, and who I think is the most likely candidate, Darkstalker Karth. The reason I lean more towards him is due to the many statues of primordial serpents you can find around the area. That, and we know for a fact he is or has recently been active in Lotharic, as Uria's death quote is, "Karth, I have failed thee." Whether it means that he's no longer alive to carry out his goals, or that Yuri is just another plan to stop the fire from linking, I just find that he has the most pointing towards him in this regard. Everything about the Archives design really reminds me of Demon's Souls 2. The 3 NPCs you fight are just like the start of 1-4, the hollows hiding around the crew defences scream 1-1, and the many knights at the stairs are just like 1-3 before the Penetrator. And I don't think this is a coincidence, it does feel like they were paying a small tribute to Boletaria here. If you explore a little bit rather than heading straight for the boss room, you can find a tucked away area for more goodies, as well as many hard-hitting angelic knights. If you can get past them, there's a birdcage with a miracle inside and a harrowing story to go along with it. The story surrounds a lady named Gertrude, a holy woman who was said to be a maiden to the Queen of Lotharic and potentially even her child. It was said that she was visited by an angel and had lost the ability to see and to speak, so she wrote down what the angel had taught her, finding a new angelic faith in Lotharic in the process. However, this wasn't accepted by the existing 3 pillars, and for her perceived crimes, she was locked away in the large birdcage we find, tortured and experimented on by the Scholars. It's now time we meet the final Lord of Cinder, Lotharic himself. Their intro cutscene sets up the confrontation well, and we're put up against his brother, Lorien. He can't walk or speak, so he moves around via teleportation, making his moves harder to predict for me. Especially since he can start up an attack, pause, teleport, and then carry it out. As established, Cyrus had a few kids, which brings up the question, if he's the father of Lotharic, Lorien, and Ocelot, who was the mother? My guess is that the woman who just keeps popping up in this video is speculation all the time. That's right, it's Guinevere. I think she was married to Cyrus for a time, but when he began to lose his mind and things were going south, she left for a more prosperous land, just like we know that she did back in Lordaeron. I could be wrong, but with the Queen of Lothar initially being known as the Goddess of Fertility and Bounty, I believe that this was done intentionally as she had the exact same title back in Dark Souls 1 as well. After the first phase, Lothar comes in to save his brother. It makes a lot of sense that he'll join in after Lorien initially falls, showing his use of magic in the cutscene to clue you in on their gimmick in phase 2. With Lothar on his brother's back, not only will you now have to deal with his homing magic, which can stun lock you and hit you hard, Lorien will be revived each time you deplete his health bar. You mainly damage Lothar by hitting him as he revives his brother, but if you're clever, you can still damage him while he's on Lorien's back. The fight does sound overwhelming, but it's balanced out by Lorien starting with less HP each time he's brought back. With the last of the Lords of Cinder fallen, I'm going to circle back to the Untended Graves now. Even after research, this place is insanely confusing to me. It's like a bizarro alternate universe of the Cemetery of Ash from the very start of the game. Whether it's in the past, future, or genuinely its own pocket reality, I have no clue. I cannot find a consistent answer. Just like the start, we're put up against Gundyr again. Champion Gundyr, now at his full potential. If you didn't know, Udex means judge. He was too late when the bells called upon him, coming to a filing shrine with no firekeeper and no way to fulfill his duty, so he serves as a judge to any unkindled revived in the Cemetery of Ash, to see if they're worthy of progressing in their journey. Once beaten, we can look through this fireless filing shrine. Nobody's here except for the old handmaiden. Why? I don't know, man. It's here we get an extremely important item, the Eyes of the Firekeeper. I'm going to give these to our Firekeeper as this is required to get what I view to be the canonical ending, but I'll elaborate on thy grand betrayal when the time comes. But I love thinking about the scenario, the Firekeeper holding a hand out thinking, oh, it's a nice gift, and feeling it, and her being like, Ashen One? What the fuck? And your character being like, oh, I promise that I found them. I didn't kill Firekeeper and take her eyes. I'm not a serial killer. Please believe me, please. For the time being, I need to go back to Irithyll Dungeon, at the section with the mummified bodies. We need to use the Path of the Dragon emote from Osiris's room, and this will take you to an entirely new area, the Dragon Area. The boss you find, the Ancient Wyvern, is more of an obstacle course than a real boss fight, since it just involves you getting past its fire breath, some enemies, before a plunging attack in his head and killing it in one go. Once the Wyvern's beaten, you're teleported to a different area, and the very next room has knights that respawn near infinitely, cycled between a couple of different ones until the Serpent Priest up top is killed. You'd think that would be the most frustrating enemy here, but no, that reward goes to the Serpent Men with the giant axe. I despise them. Also, I only learned when recording, and I've played this game a few times, the little Serpent Men are able to parry. Excuse me? No need. Past the Great Belfry Bonfire, you can finally get to the end of Hawkwood's questline. You need to help him clear the enemies up to an altar where he can return home from. I enjoy this, it's different from having to take on a boss or NPC with them. Once I see him off, I go to find Havel, who stood next to a dragon corpse. Makes sense, very on brand for him. Killing him means that the Serpent Priest can't summon him anymore. The only thing left to do is fight the last boss here, the King of the Storms and the Nameless King. Man, this is tough. Really tough, but with who he is, it makes sense as to why he's so challenging. He's nameless for a reason. This is Gwyn's firstborn. Yes, the one whose name was erased from the annals of history. This was because he left his family to side with the dragons as farmer. I'm keeping that in. His farmer waged war against. He left to side with the dragons that his father famously waged war against. It's also apparently a popular theory, specifically in the Japanese fanbase, that the Storm Drake he rides is also somebody that we've met before. none other than Ornstein, who, as someone who worked directly under the Nameless King, formed a strong bond with him, and eventually left Anor Londo to pursue and study the way of the dragon to fight alongside him again. You do get his armor set after the fight, so perhaps that's where the connection lies. With all the bosses now beaten in the base game, it's finally time to complete our initial objective, to bring the Lords of Cinder back to their thrones. Once we do this, the Firekeeper tells us more about the eyes we gave her and their nature, and if we do change our minds about mentioned grand betrayal, we need to kill her to return her to how she once was. The final area is now accessible, the Kiln of the First Flame, so seeing as we're at the end of the game, DLC notwithstanding, I'm going to finish off some more character quests. Let's start with Rosaria and Leonhardt. Her Covenant is a way to change your character's stats and appearance. You meet Leonhardt way before her, at the start of the game in fact. As long as you kill the Dark Wraith in the High Wall of Lothric after using the key he gives you. As long as you do this and give her a pale tongue, Leonhardt will appear in her room. Oh, and don't forget to kill the man grub in the room too, or the bonfire won't work. I didn't realize for a while and freaked out thinking there was like some sort of glitch. And I also forgot about the Dark Wraith at the start of the game when recording and wasted like an hour and 2 homeward bones over these. When you return, though, Rosaria will be dead, leaving behind a black eye orb. In Guinevere's old room, you can invade the world of her killer, none other than Leonhardt, to retrieve her soul. After the invasion, you have the option of bringing Rosaria back to life, which I did. I've technically finished Cyrus's quest, but you can find her sunless talisman at her grandfather's grave. It's also crucial that you finish her questline before doing Rosaria's, as you'll get locked out of it otherwise. The last quest will be ending as Hawkwood's. After you get the Dragonstone, he leaves Andre an invitation to give to us for a duel. He'll be waiting for you in the Abyss Watchers arena. Gotta be honest, Hawkwood is by far my favourite incarnation of the crestfallen warrior archetype. He doesn't simply just give up and die or do nothing and turn hollow. Although it is sad that he feels the need to fight you to the death, his last moments are him refusing to run away and facing his problems head on, falling with a sense of self fully intact in battle as a true knight. In my videos on Dark Souls 1, 2 and Bloodborne, I've always covered the DLC first before the final boss of the base game, but for this video I'm going to be talking about the base game's final boss first before speaking on the DLC, and I'll explain why in the DLC's final boss. The environment around us appears to be what I can only describe as the end. Worlds seeming to be colliding together and the dark sign hanging low in the sky. The last thing to stand in our way? The Soul of Cinder, an extremely inventive boss. He changes classes as he fights. This can range from a standard straight sword, a pyromancy backflipping scimitar user, a spear user who can utilize miracles, and a sorcerer. This is because the Soul of Cinder is the amalgamation of every single person who has ever linked the fire. The chosen undead, presumably Solaire since it's canon that he linked the fire in his world, maybe even the bearer of the curse. The way the game represents this idea has it switching its build mid-fight is nothing short of genius. But I did say everyone who's linked the fire, didn't I? And for his second phase, there's a particular trick it'll pull out, and I'm just gonna let the game speak for itself. That's right, for Phase 2, the Soul of Gwyn is called out with some new tricks, namely that he's unable to be parried and can in fact parry you. It's incredible how emotional the simple act of this boss just thrusting the sword down and those 3 notes playing, because if you've played Dark Souls 1 before, or have seen the final boss, you instantly know what this means. Just the simple act of that and those 3 notes. It's incredible how emotionally connecting it can be, and it's also incredible that Gwyn's soul is that strong in like a lore sense that it will come back and just purely take over this entity for the sole aim of preserving his age, even though it's clear It's over. The Age of Fire's done. It's linking the fire at this point is only prolonging the inevitable. And keeping it going is just causing more suffering. The fact that he believes in his age and his legacy so intensely that he will come back from the dead to preserve it is, quite frankly, incredible. With the soul of Cinderfeld, it's time for the ending. Now, Dark Souls 3 has 4 possible endings. The first is where you simply link the fire and sit whilst you burn out. Linking the flame barely seems to make a difference here, whereas in Dark Souls 1 you went up in a massive flurry of flames that filled the whole room. It just looks like you barely make a difference here. You just sit quietly and use yourself as kindling for this flame. And it really speaks to me that, like I said before, this Age of Fire, it's done. If you link it, again, you're prolonging the inevitable. It's going to die out soon. Second is the usurpation of fire, achieved by following Yuri's questline through. Yeah, the Anri corpse marrying one, where you claim the fire in the name of Hollows, and you're greeted with Yuria, more of her sisters, and possibly Anri making a small cameo at the end? It's never been clear to me. The third ending, which I'm going for, is the End of Fire. After the Soul of Cinder fight, you summon the Firekeeper, and as she's now able to see, which is forbidden for Firekeepers, she agrees to take the first flame herself, allowing it to die out completely. This is their grand betrayal. But rather than it feeling like a bad ending, I think this is canon. It's clear that the Age of Fire is due to end soon regardless of our involvement, like I keep saying. And now it's time to finally let it fade and birth something new. You can also kill the Firekeeper here for an additional ending akin to the bad ending of Demon Souls. You've even got the digging your heels in on her head at the end, but if you naturally just go for either of those endings, you are straight up evil. But no, I've always viewed the End of Fire ending as the canon choice. The Soul of Cinder is a final goodbye to the legacy, creation, and creator of the Age of Fire, and this ending is a goodbye to the endless cycle that we know. To access the DLC, head to the Cleansing Chapel and speak to Gale, the man on the floor with a massive dumpy. Remember him? After a speech, he'll pull you into the painted world of Ariandel, a wintry world akin to the painted world of Ariamus. When arriving, you're immediately greeted with a corpsey-looking guy in a pile of rot? Alright, you do you. The painted world is for people with no place to call their own, and I feel that's put across immediately with the Viking-esque enemies that are new. They're super distinctive compared to the rest of the humanoid enemies in the series. They really feel like they don't belong anywhere in Lothric, and that this is the only place that they can call home. In the nearby church, we come across a woman named Frida. She doesn't tell us much other than that we should leave, passive-aggressively telling us that we don't belong here. She's a bit of a rude cow, to be honest. There is another way to progress, but the most fun way is to cut the bridge a la the skeleton zone in the catacombs and sliding down. Not only is this one way to get onto the main path, but we can light a bonfire for an optional section that I'll return to later. We soon come across a village of bird people named Corvians, one of which is friendly and explains that Frida has managed to convince Father Ariandel to let the painting rot instead of burning it to cleanse the world as per tradition. Serving is a very clear parallel to the world outside of the painting, as the Corvian hints at. Not all of these bird fellas are friendly, however, and the Corvian assassin genuinely feel like they came out of Bloodborne, both in terms of their visual design and how fast they move. They're super tough to fight. They feel like they move just a little bit faster than your character can contend with. They're not impossible by any means though, just difficult, especially when you have to fight more than one at once. Oh my god, I spent ages in that church bit fighting 2 of them. Oh, and the Corvians that lie on the ground for a jump scare? Yeah, they got me. Further on, Sir Wilhelm, who has an incredible voice by the way, attempts to stop us from continuing on, so We take him down, and in his dying words he reveals who he's working for, none other than Frida. In the very same building we come across a young woman who calls Gale her uncle. We'll only know her as the painter. She doesn't do anything else for the moment, but she'll be more important at the end of the DLC. The snowfields are a lot bigger than I expected, but they end up looping back around to the basement of the church you meet Frida in. The bottom has a lever that you need to spin to progress, but the placement of it, as well as Priscilla's old arena you can get to in the distance, and the look of Ariandel in general, it's clear this is supposed to be a very rotted yet closely related to Ariamis from Dark Souls 1. Before I get to the two bosses in this DLC, I'm going to quickly fight the NPC who spawns in Priscilla's old stomping grounds. The first is the Champion Gravetender, the optional boss. Honestly, it's really underwhelming. He's a pretty forgettable NPC who starts with a couple of wolves. Hell, even the giant wolf that's been menacing you throughout all of Ariandel joins the fray, and it doesn't make the fight much better. It's pretty much just a worse Sif on a sugar rush zipping about the place. Although I suppose it's better than being a worse Sif that's addicted to black tar heroin like the Royal Rat Authority was. There's a tiny bit more to explore down here for a few extra items, but a really interesting piece of cut content lies in one of the tree enemies you find a spell under. It has cut dialogue of it asking for its child to come back and that it's cold, then accusing you of kidnapping before attacking. I believe this could potentially be Pontiff Sullivan's mother, as he has a similar appearance to these enemies. We know that he was born in the Painted World and left, and said spell directly mentions Sullivan in its description. Finally though, we get to meet Father Ariandel himself, and of course Sister Frida finally takes action to put an end to us. Her first phase is extremely manageable, with her being very easy to stagger, and her taking notes from Priscilla by finding her footprints in the snow when she turns invisible. After beating her, Father Ariandel goes absolutely mental and brings her back to life by smacking his pot on the floor, joining the fight. Thank God they both share a health bar. The pair do a great job at covering each other's weaknesses. Ariandel hits like a truck, but his movements are slow and predictable, meaning it's easy to get a few good hits in behind his back, whereas Frida can hit you many more times despite not doing as much damage, as well as being able to heal. You get a Titanite slab for beating them, and it seems like the battle's over, but oh no, this only begins the third phase against Black Flame Frida, one of the toughest bosses in the game. She's hard on her own, her movement speed or damage are absolutely insane, and she has the same issue I have with the Corvian Knights, as in I feel she's a little too fast for Dark Souls 3's usual combat speed. All this on top of having to deal with the earlier two phases means you have a lot of work cut out for you. Not that it makes for a bad fight, not in the least. Overall, Ashes of Ariandel is a really fun and well-crafted piece of DLC, but in comparison to every other piece of DLC made up to this point, it feels incredibly short. Nowadays, this isn't really an issue, since as far as I'm aware, the vast majority of ways to buy Dark Souls 3 is all DLC included, but I could see why some people would have been upset with it upon release, and I thought this was worth acknowledging at least. After the grueling fight, the painter moves to the floor above, accessed via a ladder next to the bonfire. She thanks us for our help, but she still needs to finish her painting, and so we move on to the next DLC, landing in the Dreg Heap. This seems to be an explorable portion of the environment we see around the Soul of Cinder arena, with all worlds colliding like I mentioned before. The upcoming area will only support my theory on this too. The Dreg Heap introduces a new mechanic, falling at great heights into piles of soot to negate fall damage, indicated by messages and phantoms left behind by Gale. We also find a new enemy called Angels that can only be killed by finding the enemy rooted into the ground that connects to them. I adore their design, it and the sounds they make are very creepy, but when it comes to gameplay, they are so frustrating to get around. I strongly believe that they're connected to the pilgrim butterflies, and that pilgrims can incarnate into two different forms. This and the butterflies. How and why this happens? I have no clue though. Later on, we meet a knight named Lap who has no memory of who he is, but he seems like a friendly enough guy. We end up in an even more ruined version of Earthen Peak, the poison swamp from Dark Souls 2. Like I said, further supporting that this is the worlds of Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3 all mashed together. I've explored everything that's worthwhile here, so the only thing to do next is to plunge into the depths below and start the boss against the demon in pain and the demon from below. Their story parallels Lorien and Lothric in a few ways. The result of their battle against Lorien has left them with lasting injuries, just like him. It seems that they're potentially fighting in an attempt to rekindle the Chaos Flame that has most likely died, and as it's the Prince of Demonkind, it's safe to assume that they would have the power to do so. One will be incredibly aggressive, whilst the other will take a step back, mainly firing projectiles. They take turns doing this, although sometimes the fight can bug out and both of them will be aggressive, which is not good at all. Killing them both summons the Demon Prince, who has a different moves depending on which demon was killed last. If the demon in pain is killed first, it will primarily focus on sweeping, close-range attacks, whilst if the demon from below is beaten last, it'll go ham on the HP melting projectiles. The fight will be challenging either way, but I think the demon in pain moveset is a bit easier. After the hectic battle, if you look at the surroundings, it turns out that this is Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1, pretty much completely destroyed. Going forward, we will be taken to the namesake of the DLC, the Ring City, and what a greeting we get. Immediately having a giant figure summon lots of archer sprites, having to use cover and tucked away paths to avoid being almost instantly killed. I'm honestly not a fan of this giant asshole. Once getting past him, we run into Lap again. He's still searching for something called the Purging Monument in an attempt to recover his memory. Further on, a woman behind a door tasks us with slaying a dragon named Medea, and oh, we'll get to him soon, don't you worry. In the meantime, we've got to look around this swamp, and at least it isn't poison. Ever since we landed in the Ring City, we've come across a locust preacher who constantly speaks about embracing the dark. I think the stories he tells are meant to be callbacks to characters we've met on our journeys. Specifically, although he's pretty vague, I think he's talking about Alva, Seeker of the Spurned on the first one. The second is probably the most unclear, either being Orbeck of Vindhelm, Seath the Scaleless, or Bit-Hat Logan. The third one's about Cyrus, and the last referencing Irina and Aegon of Kareem. Although it's worth mentioning he had a cut 5th sermon referencing Ringfinger Leonhart. Oh, and fuck the invader with a giant hammer. He's genuinely evil. I despise him. He stunlocks you with a little pebble and then hits you in one go and kills you. And he's the worst. I'm not really a fan of the Show Your Humanity puzzle either. I initially thought you had to be embered, but in fact you need to go into the swamp, use the young white branch item until you transform into a humanity sprite, slowly hover over to where the ladder is and wait for it to fall down. I just don't think there's enough in-game information to help you come to this answer naturally. But I suppose it's not required for progress, it's mainly here to open up the path to the Purging Monument that Lap is looking for. Once you find it, run back and tell Lap the location so that he can make his way over. Our next destination is a stone bridge, but Medea, the dragon the woman from before told us about, is on patrol. Past him is a derelict tower that we're unable to progress through thanks to a bunch of debris, but there's Lap saying that he's found some treasure. This scenario's pretty familiar. Turns out, Lap is none other than Patches, who kicks us down once again, but this time I think it was done to actually help the player, since this is really the only way for us to leave the tower, finally having Patches do a good deed as he bows out of the Souls series for a final time. Well, until the Demon Souls remake in Elden Ring, but that's beside the point, they didn't exist when this was made, so shush. On the other side, it's time for a battle with Medea on an unsturdy pathway, which we managed to throw him off of, but we haven't quite seen the last of him. After this, the player finds a statue of Gwyn and a kneeling pygmy. Now, I believe this is specifically the furtive pygmy, but I'll get into the implications of this later. It's onward to the church. An ominous voice turns us away as soon as we get to the door, but I'm gonna listen at this point, so I just ignore it and roll right on in. This fight is against Half-Light, Spear of the Church. An adjudicator enemy is who tells the player to turn back, and will attack you if you get too close to buy time, as well as spawning a Painting Guardian. The reason why? Because this fight is against another player, or an NPC if one isn't found, like the old monk from Demon Souls. On the way to Half-Light, there's a gap in the wall on the lift down. You can jump through for a secret area. On the right hand side is a gap that you can land onto the statue of Gwyn and the pygmy for a ring. To the left is a corpse with an ember, however the statue next to it is illusionary. Travel down the huge hall for a rematch with Dark Eater Medea, who is, in my opinion, the hardest boss in the entire Souls series. Elden Ring and Sekiro notwithstanding, just counting Souls, hell, maybe even Bloodborne as well. Fighting him in co-op was absolute suffering. I tried for what must have been hours with no luck, but on a whim, I tried to fight him alone and I ended up beating him on my first attempt somehow. Don't get me wrong, it was still really difficult, but I'm just glad that I finally beat him. Hooray! Getting back on the main path, in the room above the Spear of the Church arena, we find a woman with an egg. Touch the egg, and look what you fucking did. You fool. You absolute simpleton. The egg was the key to keep the appearance that the Ring City was thriving. The woman's name is Filianor, another daughter of Gwyn. She was given to the Pygmies along with the city, and while she slumbered, the illusion would stay. Now she's awake, we've brought the city to the present, or rather its true form. An endless desert, a shattered egg, and now Filianor being a corpse. And almost right away, a pygmy crawls towards Filianor, half dead and covered in his own blood, saying that he's scared of the red hood that's come to eat him. Even if he gets to Filianor, he'll die next to her. And when I said I wanted to talk about the implication of the furtive pygmy in Gwyn before, this is where it comes to a head for me. Gwyn gave them the Ring City to subjugate them, to make sure he had full tabs on humanity and the origin of the Dark Soul. He gave them this. It appeared to be totally benevolent, giving them this huge city and his daughter to assumedly keep them secure, but he basically put them in a prison that they most likely willingly accepted as a gift, and that's really messed up the more you think about it. Of course, the Red Hood is Gale. He's consumed the last of the Ring City's original residents to obtain the blood of the Dark Soul. His only obstacle from obtaining it fully? Us. Whilst the Soul of Cinder felt like a goodbye to the world of the Dark Souls trilogy, Gale feels like a goodbye to the players, both of them fitting final bosses in their own unique ways. There's a theory on why Gale recruits us in the first place, and it's one I find myself agreeing with quite heavily. The theory goes that Gale set on this quest knowing that he wouldn't make it back with his sanity intact, or at all, so recruited and helped you along the way, so even if he were to die, by your own hand or otherwise, the Dark Soul could still be found for his lady's painting. And Gale, he makes such a good, fitting end as a boss to the Dark Souls trilogy because he is a slave knight, he is on the lowest of the low in the totem pole, he was just another one of presumably many, many nameless, faceless soldiers to be thrown out at the whims of the gods and just to die in some random battlefield somewhere. But who is it that's made it to the end of the world? It's not Gwyn, it's not any of the gods, it's not any of the high-ranking knights or noblemen under the god's name, it's not even his age that's stood this test of time. It's humans, it's humanity. Two humans made it to the ends of the earth and that are fighting to preserve humanity. Gale, even if he didn't realize it in his feral state, all that he's done is so that humanity can have a better place to live. He's done all he can to get what he could of the Dark Soul, so he can give the pigment to his lady, so she can make a better world in his stead. And he's brought the player on this path, even if he's not going to make it back. He knows the player has what it takes to beat him. He knows that either way, humanity's gonna prevail, and humanity is gonna have a better place to call home. And that is probably the most fitting end that you can give to the players of Dark Souls, to humanity. The surroundings may look like an empty wasteland, but there's one thing of note to do after the battle against Gale. Namely Shira, the lady behind the door who first told us about Medea and who you can summon to fight him. She appears as the final NPC battle. Moreover, she spawns right at the area that looks just like the Asylum Demon's room. How fitting for this to be the final area in the Souls franchise then. The last thing to do is to go back to the painter in Ariandel and to hand her the pigment for the Dark Souls so she can create a new painting. A new world named after your character. It'll be a cold, dark, and gentle place, making for a good home and ending the stories of the 2 DLCs for Dark Souls 3. It has some aspects I'm not a fan of, but I couldn't think of a more fitting end for the Dark Souls series, and what criticisms I do have doesn't really impact on my enjoyment of the game as a whole all that much. Whilst Dark Souls 1 is still my favourite out of the 3, Dark Souls 3 is truly an amazing sequel and a phenomenal end to a truly unforgettable series. And that is the end of the video and my final big analysis on the Dark Souls trilogy. Took a lot of work. This was way overdue due to a variety of reasons, but I'm glad I've just got to the end of it now and I can put this video out there. But that's not going to be the end of content that I'm making for Dark Souls on this channel. I'll have my boss rankings right after this, as I always do. And I was planning on announcing this in the boss rankings, but I felt it was more appropriate here. I will be making a Dark Souls Trilogy iceberg video. I was originally going to do icebergs on the individual games, kind of as I went, but I just kind of decided that it would be more fitting to do an iceberg on the whole trilogy, rather than just going one by one. It is still very much in the planning stages, so I'll talk more about it in the actual iceberg video, obviously, but I wanted to announce that is in the works. It's in very early planning, but that is, like I say, a video that I'm going to be making. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like it, and this did take a lot of work and editing, so you know, if you're enjoying this, you know, and you're enjoying my content, my analysis, my kind of more on the fly videos, please subscribe. There is going to be more coming on FromSoft games. I'm planning on doing Sekiro, the Demon Souls, a video on the Demon Souls remake, and Elden Ring, obviously, but that probably won't be until like a good ways off. I think I'm probably going to be doing the Sekiro video sooner, but yeah, like I say, I'll probably be taking a little break before covering those games. Not as big of a break as I've taken between Dark Souls 2 and this, though, or Bloodborne and this even. But yeah, this is going to be the end of the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.